She trusted a stranger more than her own instincts, and a single flight turned that trust into her disappearance. Lina Karev lived a quiet, predictable life in a small coastal town where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. Her days were simple, often repeating the same routine, which slowly made her feel disconnected from the world beyond her surroundings. Nights were different. That was when she explored the internet, watching travel videos and reading stories about people who had changed their lives overnight. It gave her a sense of escape. One evening, while browsing a discussion forum, she came across a profile named Adrian Voss. His posts stood out. They were thoughtful, calm, and strangely personal, as if written for someone who needed to hear them. Lina responded to one of his comments, not expecting anything more than a brief exchange. But the replies kept coming. Over the following weeks, their conversations became more frequent. Adrian shared details about his life in a distant city filled with bright lights and endless opportunities. He described a lifestyle that felt completely opposite to Lina's quiet world. He seemed to understand her fears, her dreams, and the feeling of being stuck. Gradually, Lina began to trust him. He sent photos of his surroundings, snapshots of a modern apartment, and views from high-rise windows. Everything looked real, almost too perfect. Lina never questioned it. Instead, she found comfort in the idea that someone out there saw her in a way no one else did. Without realizing it, she began to plan a future that depended entirely on someone she had never met. Lina's journey began before sunrise, when the streets of her town were still empty and silent. She carried a single suitcase, packed carefully with clothes and a few personal items she believed would help her start fresh. At the airport, everything felt larger than life. The crowds, the announcements, the constant movement, it all made her feel both small and excited. As she moved through security and waited at the gate, she kept checking her phone. Adrian had sent a final message with simple instructions and reassurance that everything was ready. Reading those words gave her confidence, even though a quiet sense of unease lingered in the back of her mind. The flight was long and exhausting. Hours passed slowly as Lina sat by the window, watching clouds drift beneath her. She tried to imagine what would happen when she finally arrived. Every detail she had been told replayed in her thoughts. The more she thought about it, the more real it became. When the plane landed, the unfamiliar city stretched out around her. Bright lights, foreign signs, and a different language made everything feel distant. She followed the crowd through the airport, gripping her suitcase tightly. For a moment, she paused, expecting to see someone waiting for her. But no one was there. Her phone buzzed. A message from Adrian explained that something urgent had come up. He couldn't meet her, but he had arranged everything. Lina read the instructions carefully, taking a deep breath before moving forward alone, trusting that this was just a small delay in a new beginning. The taxi ride felt longer than it should have. Lina sat quietly in the back seat, watching unfamiliar streets pass by through the window. The city looked different from what she had imagined. It was quieter, less vibrant, with long stretches of empty roads and buildings that seemed almost identical. She checked her phone again, rereading the address Adrian had sent, making sure there was no mistake. When the taxi finally stopped, Lina stepped out and looked up at the building. It stood in a narrow street, surrounded by similar structures, all plain and lifeless. There were no signs of activity, no people nearby, just a stillness that made her hesitate for a moment. Still, she reminded herself that not every place needed to be lively. She paid the driver, adjusted her grip on the suitcase, and walked toward the entrance. A small camera was mounted above the door, silently recording her arrival. She paused briefly, as if expecting someone to open the door from inside, but nothing happened. After a few seconds, she reached for the handle and stepped in. The hallway was dimly lit, with a faint echo following her footsteps. Everything felt too quiet. Lina checked her phone once more and found the apartment number. Each step toward it felt heavier than the last. When she reached the door, it was already unlocked. She pushed it open slowly and stepped inside, unaware that this would be the last moment she would ever be seen in public. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Lina placed her suitcase near the wall and looked around the apartment, taking in every detail. It was clean, organized, and almost empty, as if no one truly lived there. The silence felt heavier inside than it had outside. She walked from one room to another, expecting to find signs of life, but there was nothing personal, No photos, no clothes, no trace of Adrian. Minutes turned into hours. Lina checked her phone repeatedly, waiting for a message that didn't come. The earlier reassurance began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. She tried to stay calm, convincing herself that delays happen, that everything would make sense soon. Outside, the world moved on as usual, unaware of what was unfolding inside that quiet apartment. By the evening, Lina's online presence had gone completely silent. No messages were sent, no calls were made. Her phone showed no activity after that point. It was as if everything had suddenly stopped. Back in her hometown, her family began to worry. Lina had promised to update them once she arrived, but there was nothing. At first, they assumed she was busy settling in or dealing with travel fatigue. But as the hours turned into an entire day, the silence became impossible to ignore. Days passed with no word. The concern grew into fear, and eventually, a missing person report was filed. Authorities began to look into her last known location, starting with the airport and slowly tracing her path toward the place where everything had gone quiet. Investigators began by focusing on the one person Lina had trusted the most. The name Adrian Voss appeared in her messages, her notes, and the travel details she had saved. It seemed like the obvious place to start. However, the deeper they looked, the more the name began to fall apart. There were no official records linked to it. No identification, no work history, no address that could be verified. It was as if the person Lina had spoken to for months had never existed outside of a screen. The profile she had interacted with was carefully constructed, filled with small details that made it believable, yet none of it could be traced back to a real individual. The photos Adrian had shared were examined closely. Investigators discovered that each image came from different online sources. Some were taken from old social media accounts belonging to unrelated people, while others were pulled from public listings. The apartment images matched rental advertisements posted months earlier. Everything had been assembled piece by piece to create a convincing illusion. Attention then shifted to the apartment itself. Records showed it had been rented under a false identity using forged documents. The payment had been made in cash, leaving no digital trail. The lease was short-term, set to expire just days after Lina's arrival. Every step pointed to careful planning. Whoever had arranged this meeting had taken deliberate measures to remain hidden, leaving behind just enough information to guide Lina there, but nothing that could lead back to them. The apartment was examined again, this time with greater attention to detail. At first, it appeared untouched, almost staged to look ordinary. Surfaces were spotless, furniture was minimal, and there were no signs of struggle. It felt less like a place someone lived in and more like a temporary setup designed for a single purpose. Investigators began to question what might have been missed during the initial search. They checked behind furniture, inside vents, and along the edges of the ceiling. That was when something unusual caught their attention. A small device had been carefully hidden in a corner, positioned in a way that blended into the room. It was a camera. The device had been placed with precision, aimed directly toward the entrance and main area of the apartment. It wasn't visible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Once recovered, the footage inside became the most important piece of evidence in the case. The recording showed Lina entering the apartment, just as the building's external camera had captured. She looked around briefly, setting her suitcase down and moving cautiously through the space. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then, without warning, a faint movement appeared at the edge of the frame. A shadow shifted behind her. The camera angle never revealed a face, only a partial outline that quickly moved out of view. Lina's reaction was sudden, but before anything more could be understood, the footage cut off completely. The recording ended there, leaving more questions than answers and confirming that Lina had not been alone inside that apartment. As the investigation deepened, officers began comparing Lina's case with older reports that had once seemed unrelated. Missing persons files from different regions were reopened, each involving individuals who had traveled to meet someone they knew only through the internet. At first, the similarities appeared minor, but patterns slowly began to form. In several cases, the victims had been in regular contact with someone using a carefully crafted identity. The conversations often lasted for months, building trust step by step. Each victim had been given a location to meet, usually a rented space that left little trace behind. Some of those who returned described last-minute changes in plans or unexplained behavior that made them leave early. Others were never seen again. What made Lina's case stand out was the presence of the hidden camera. It suggested something more deliberate, something beyond a simple meeting gone wrong. Investigators started to believe that the person behind these identities might have been documenting everything, possibly keeping records that had not yet been discovered. Digital forensics teams worked through fragments of data, tracing accounts, analyzing patterns in writing style, and mapping connections between different profiles. Small overlaps began to appear, hints that multiple identities could belong to a single individual or a tightly controlled operation. The realization changed the direction of the case. This was no longer about one missing person. It pointed toward a method, repeated with precision, refined over time. And if the pattern continued, it raised a troubling possibility that someone, somewhere, was already preparing to use it again. Months passed, but the investigation never reached a clear conclusion. Leads appeared and disappeared just as quickly, each one raising hope before fading into uncertainty. The identity behind Adrian Voss remained unknown, hidden behind layers of false information and carefully erased traces. Every digital path seemed to end in silence. The apartment lease expired shortly after Lina's arrival, and no one came forward to claim responsibility for it. Neighbors reported nothing unusual, no sounds, no disturbances, nothing that could explain what had happened inside. It was as if everything had been designed to leave no impact at all. The footage from the hidden camera became the most haunting piece of evidence. Investigators reviewed it repeatedly, hoping to notice something they had missed. The shadow, the sudden movement, the abrupt ending. Each detail suggested something critical had occurred just outside the frame. Yet no matter how closely it was examined, it never revealed enough. Lina Karev was never found. Her case remained open, filed among others that shared the same unanswered questions. Authorities continued to monitor similar reports, aware that the pattern might repeat. Warnings were issued about online identities and the risks of trusting someone without verification, but for Lina, those warnings came too late. Somewhere, the person responsible had vanished just as completely as the identity they had created. And while the world moved forward, the final moments captured on that silent recording remained unchanged, holding the last trace of a story that never reached its ending.